You Can Score! Smashing Victories in the Open Sicilian by Nigel Povah. In recent years, close versions of the Sicilian, where white delays an early pawn to queen 4, have become almost as popular as open variations. A veritable plethora of dragons, Taimanovs, Scheveningans, and even pelicans have arisen to plague the white player, so it is not surprising that he has retreated behind a wall of pawns as soon as one pawn to queen's bishop 4 comes into view. This tape is written as a morale booster, to show that smashing victories on the white side of the open Sicilian are, and should be, the rule. One of the country's leading exponents of aggressive play in these lines is British master Nigel Povah. So, over to Nigel.
On this tape, we will try to show you several lines which offer you the chance to smash your opponent should he have the nerve to play the Sicilian defence. We will also give you the chance to gauge your likely successes in these lines by asking you to switch off at critical points and analyse the position yourself. If you do well in these tests, then you have confidence that you will also succeed over the board. However, make allowances for your own grading. If you are, say, grade 120, then you should not expect to get the positions right, for they are from games played between 200 plus players. But if you do fairly well, this is okay, for your likely opponents in the future are going to be around 120 to 150, not grade 200 plus, and thus themselves they will play more weakly than the opponents on this tape. We start with the ever-popular dragon. Please have your board set up in this starting position, and we shall go over to the game Povah v Hindle in the Even Standard Open of 1974. The game started pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3, black pawn to d6, white pawn to d4, and black takes on d4, c takes d4. White knight recaptures on d4, and black plays knight to f6. White knight to c3, and black plays pawn to g6. This move, pawn to g6, characterizes the dragon. Black's bishop at g7 is going to exert pressure through the center and upon white's queen side. White now played 6 bishop to e3 to give support to his knight at d4. Black moved bishop to g7, and white played pawn to f3, thus reaching diagram 1. The move pawn to f3 initiates the deadly Yugoslav variation. The pawn supports e4, which means that white may later move his knight to d5 without fear of losing the e-pawn. The pawn at f3 also guards the square g4. That means black's knight at f6 is unable to go to g4 to harass the white bishop at e3. So white can continue in peace to play queen d2 and then bishop h6 to exchange off black's strong bishop at g7. As an aside, I should mention that had black played knight g4 on the previous move, white would have smashed him with bishop b5 check. What else does the move pawn f3 accomplish? It is a step in a general pawn rush on the king side, featuring the moves white pawn g4, pawn h4, and then pawn h5. Actually, the full treatment Yugoslav, with the moves just mentioned, rarely occurs nowadays, as black's attack develops too rapidly on the other wing. White generally plays a quick pawn h4 to h5 to open up the h-file and only uses the move g4 as a backup. Now let us continue with the game. From diagram 1, black played knight c6, white queen d2, black o-o, castles kingside, white bishop c4, black bishop d7, and white O, castles queenside. The plans are developing. White has castled queenside, black on the kings, and at present white's development and advantage in space look impressive. At the same time, all black's pieces seem to be on useful squares, and he has the C file for his rooks to play down. In this position, which is diagram 2, many moves have been tried for black. One popular one was black queen to A5. White bishop would then go to B3. Black rook on F8 would come to C8. And the white king would go to B1. And then black would generally play knight to E5. But this variation has fallen from favour due to the move white bishop to G5 here. A move that has some point when you realise that black's knight on F6 guards an important strategical square D5. If you want to know more about this line, details are included in the accompanying booklet. From the position in diagram 2, and would you please reset your pieces to that diagram now, switch off if necessary. Another move is Stein's Queen B8, but this is also in a bad way. See the next game on the tape. In this particular game, black played Rook C8, which is the modern treatment. Black doesn't bother yet trying to get his king's rook into play and aims for immediate action down the c-file. White here played bishop to b3, black knight to e5. There isn't much sense in exchanging knights, which would only bring the white bishop to a strong square at d4, but black is keen to manoeuvre his knight to c4, which would force white to part with one of his well-placed bishops. After black knight e5, white played pawn h4. I should mention that bishop g5 is another very interesting possibility here, but it's not to be considered on this tape, maybe some future tape. Black now played pawn to h5. This looks a rather risky move, but it was all the rage about 3 to 4 years ago. The idea is to slow down white's attack, because any further advance of white pawns on the king's side to open up lines will involve considerable expenditure of the said pawns. As you can see, black has a lot of pieces attacking the g4 square, and if white wants to play that move, he'll have to make a sacrifice of it. The main alternative to black pawn to h5 is black knight to c4. This was analysed on Eric Moscow's tape on the dragon, so we won't touch that here. Now, in this position, after black pawn to h5, you might like to switch off here and decide your course of action as white. White's choice of move here was the knight sortie, knight d5. This was my own idea, and the intention is to weaken black's kingside by removing a defender. I'd used it to gain a draw against Danny Wright about a year earlier. Play continued. Black knight takes d5. White bishop takes d5. Black knight c4. White bishop takes c4. Black rook takes c4, and now white pawn to g4, thus reaching the position of diagram 3. White isn't worried about sacrificing the odd pawn. As Fisher said, this type of position is just a matter of prizing open the h-file and then sack, mate. After a white pawn g4, Hindle as black played skeptically, black h-pawn takes on g4. I consider black rook to a4 is perhaps a little better. However, the game continued with white playing pawn to h5 to open the h-file, and black tried to keep the h-file closed by playing pawn to g5. Perhaps safer would have been pawn to e5. Switch off here and decide on your future plan as white. White continued in straightforward style with 18 pawn to h6. Black played bishop to e5 and white pawn to b3. Black played rook to c8 and white played pawn to h7 check, thus preventing black playing king h7 and blockading the h-pawn. Black now played king to h8. Now the black king looks fairly snug behind white's h-pawn for the moment. White now played bishop takes g5, and black g takes f3. Black still doesn't believe white's attack and has another pawn. He should have tried for activity on the black squares with queen b6, though after white bishop takes e7, it is still clearly in to white's advantage. Once again, switch off and choose a move for white. What was your choice? I played bishop h6, attacking the rook at f8, though not with the intention of capturing it. Black played pawn f2, and white played queen takes f2. Black queen to b6. This is diagram 4. Here I suggest you switch off again and decide on your play as white. Take a fairly long think, as the position has many intriguing tactical points to it. Well, if you chose either queen g2 or queen g1, full marks. They are similar in effect, perhaps queen g2 had been slightly more accurate. After the queen g2, the main line is bishop takes d4, white rook from d1 to g1, and as you can see there's a deadly threat of mate at g7. Black cannot of course capture the rook at g1 because the self-same mate at g7. Black could actually play bishop e3 check, white king to b1, and then bishop takes h6, but we leave you to work out the answer to that. In the actual game, from diagram 4, so switch off and set up the pieces in that position if you need to, I chose white queen to g1. This maintains the guard on the knight at d4, but did you notice the threat? If you didn't, switch off here and decide what it is that white is threatening. White's tremendous threat is to play queen g8 check, opening the files for a double rook mate. For example, if black rook takes g8, white pawn takes g8 equals queen, giving check, and then rook takes queen, then white plays bishop f8 and it's mate, or it's going to be mate very quickly. If on the other hand white had played king takes g8, then white would play rook from d1 to g1 check, and mate would soon follow. Thus, from the position in diagram 4, switch off again and set up the position if you need to. After white's queen g1, black had no choice but to play pawn to f5 to prepare a bolt hole for his king. White moved rook to d2, and black played bishop takes d4. Please switch off again and decide on your play as white. White nonchalantly ignored the attack on his queen and played rook g2, after which mate is again inevitable. If black takes the queen, then white bishop g7 is strong in reply. And if he doesn't, he will have no defence anyway to the threat rook g8 check, black rook takes g8, white pawn takes g8 equals queen check, black rook takes queen, and bishop g7 double discovered check mate. So, after white rook g2, black played rather forlornly bishop b2 check, white king takes b2, and black resigned. That game was co-winner of the Brilliancy Prize in that tournament. Our next example is another dragon, but in this case Stein's Queen b8 variation. Please reset your pieces to the position in diagram 2. The game we are going to follow is Povah against Vlam from the Victories Masters Reserves of 1977. Black played Queen b8 here. This is another peculiar looking move, but the idea is to launch a quick pawn rush on the queen side with pawn a5 and pawn b5 and so on. This is to be backed up by all Black's major pieces, his rook at a8, his queen at b8 and the other rook at c8. The point of Black's move Queen b8 comes when we realise that the other positions of the Black queen at a5 often runs into difficulties because White can sometimes exchange queens into a favourable ending with knight to d5. After Black's queen to b8, White charged forward with pawn h4. Black rook to f8, f8 to c8, and White bishop to b3. Black pawn to a5, and White pawn to h5. As this is a critical position, I'd like you to switch off and study it for at least 5 minutes. It is Black to move. From diagram 5, Black has frequently tried to take advantage of the paucity of squares available to White's bishop at b3 by playing knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, Black pawn to a4, and White bishop to d5. And now Black pawn to e6. This move actually traps the bishop, but the consequences are not rosy. White plays pawn takes g6. And now switch off the cassette and decide how you would reply should Black answer h pawn takes on g6. White plays here queen to g5 in order to answer pawn takes d5 with White queen takes f6. But what do you play in answer to Black pawn in to e5? Switch off here and consider this move. This is as the game Hodgson v Paunovic in the London-Belgrade telex match. If you don't see White's winning play immediately, it's easy to get entangled in other variations. Julian Hodgson, who was only 12 at the time, saw it immediately, and he played rook to h8 check. If Black plays bishop takes rook, he is crushed by queen takes g6 check, because this move is check and Black has no time for knight takes the bishop on d5. Paunovic therefore captured the rook on h8 with his king, but Hodgson coolly played bishop takes f7, and despite Black's extra rook, somewhat ineffectually placed on the queen side, he cannot avoid defeat through queen takes g6 and rook h1 check. Let us now return to diagram 6, so switch off and set up the relevant position. Now we are going to investigate Black's other pawn recapture, f takes g6. This occurred in the game Povah v Tudhope in the 24th Students' Olympiad in Mexico, 1977. Switch off now and decide what you would play as White. White played here bishop takes f6. Black replied bishop takes f6, and White played queen h6. Black bishop to g7. White queen takes h7 check. Black king went to f7, and White played rook h6, and obviously White has quite an overwhelming attack here. Finally, please switch off again and return to diagram 6. How should White play if Black recaptures the bishop at d5 straight away? Please study this problem and switch off if necessary. If Black pawn captures on d5, White can play G takes H7 check. Black king to H8. And now white queen to F4. This move deserving an exclamation mark. Black knight to E8.